Zirac stood at the center of the Grand Terran Academic Forum, their bioluminescent skin pulsing in slow, deliberate waves of authority. Thousands of human scholars, scientists, and intellectuals had gathered, their expressions ranging from intrigue to barely concealed amusement. The vast auditorium buzzed with whispered speculation, but Zirac remained unshaken. This was a defining moment, not just for themselves, but for the entire Kthari Dominion. For centuries, their species had dominated intellectual pursuits across the known galaxy. The Kthari measured a civilization's worth not by its military strength or technological advances, but by its ability to solve the most complex intellectual challenges. By their standards, humanity was a young, impulsive species, remarkable only for its stubborn adaptability. But adaptability alone was not intelligence. And today, Zirac would prove it. Raising a clawed hand, they activated the holographic projector. A swirling construct of impossible angles and shifting patterns materialized in the air. The alien puzzle was an ancient test of cognition, logic, and multidimensional spatial reasoning. No species had ever solved it. Even the brightest minds in the Dominion had taken decades to unravel its mysteries. The puzzle was designed not only to challenge intelligence but to expose the cognitive limits of lesser species. The trial of infinite reflections, Zirac announced, their voice a measured resonance of authority. A test that no civilization has conquered on its first attempt. You are invited to try. Silence followed. The humans stared at the projection, their expressions unreadable. Zirac had expected many reactions: frustration, fascination, perhaps even awe. What they had not expected was the sound of someone laughing. It was a short, incredulous chuckle from somewhere in the audience. Then another. And another. Before Zirac could react, the laughter spread like wildfire. Humans turned to one another, whispering, grinning, shaking their heads. Some pulled out devices, comparing notes. Others were already sketching crude versions of the puzzle onto notepads, speaking in quick, animated bursts. Zirac's frills tightened against their skull. Silence, they demanded, their voice clipped with irritation. What is the meaning of this reaction? A young human scientist in the front row, still chuckling, raised a hand. No offense, Professor Zirac, but this is just a variant of a children's game. Zirac's bioluminescence flickered erratically. Impossible. The scientist tapped at their tablet and projected a crude, two-dimensional version of the puzzle onto the screen beside Zirac's. It's almost the same. It's like a hypercomplex version of an old Earth game called Lights Out or maybe Rubik's Cube. But the core principles? Yeah, they're identical. More murmurs. More confirmations. Someone in the back actually snapped their fingers and exclaimed, "Oh. That's why it looked familiar." Zirac's pulse quickened. This test is designed to evaluate superior cognition across multiple dimensions. You mean to tell me this is something humans, children, solve for amusement? Pretty much, another scientist said, shrugging. It's not exactly the same, but if you understand the fundamentals, solving your version wouldn't take long. Zirac felt a cold, creeping sensation deep in their core. This was not how today was supposed to unfold. The Kthari had designed this test to be an impenetrable barrier, a testament to their intellectual dominance. And yet, these humans were treating it as an amusement. Prove it, Zirac snapped. The young scientist grinned, cracked their knuckles, and stepped forward. Watch closely, Professor. Within minutes, the room became a storm of calculations, hypotheses, and collaborative efforts. Where other species had labored for decades, humanity played. The puzzle was dissected, its logic unraveled, and within an astonishingly short time, the solution lay before them. Zirac's breath hitched. The scholar's challenge had become a child's pastime. And nothing would ever be the same again. Zirac's frills twitched erratically, their bioluminescent patterns flickering in confused, disjointed pulses. The laughter, the sheer ease with which these humans treated the test, was an insult to everything the Kthari believed about intelligence. The trial of infinite reflections was a masterpiece of logic, a puzzle crafted to strain the cognitive boundaries of even the most advanced species. And yet, The humans were solving it with the casual enthusiasm of hatchlings playing with puzzle blocks. A ripple of motion spread through the assembled crowd as screens lit up, displaying various human versions of the challenge. Some were old digital puzzles, others were mechanical toys, but the principles were unmistakably the same. The humans weren't merely familiar with the puzzle, they had been playing variations of it for generations. Zirax's voice, usually a measured tone of scholarly authority, wavered slightly. You claim this is a game? One of the scientists, a woman with dark-rimmed glasses and an amused smirk, nodded. Not just a game. A children's game. She gestured at a large holographic screen where a simplified version of the puzzle was being demonstrated. You see, the trick is recognizing the repeating patterns. Once you identify the cycles, solving it is just a matter of reversing the sequence. Zirax stared at the simulation, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. The scientist had unraveled the puzzle's logic in seconds. Not by methodical, incremental analysis like a proper Kthari scholar, but through instinct, as if the solution was second nature. Another researcher chimed in. Actually, this reminds me of an old Earth logic puzzle called the Towers of Hanoi. It's got the same fundamental principles, move pieces in a certain order to reach a goal. Except that game has been around for over a century. A century. Zirax felt something close to vertigo. The Kthari had been refining the trial of infinite reflections for thousands of years. They had used it as a benchmark to separate the truly gifted from the merely competent. And yet, humans had mastered the same logic before they had even reached the stars. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. The alien dignitaries present, representatives from the Twel, the Roduan, and the Zalari, were watching with silent intensity. The implications were clear. If humanity had so easily conquered what the Kthari considered an impossible challenge, then what else had they underestimated about this species? Zirax felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping into their mind, one they had never experienced before. Doubt. The laughter, once an irritant, had now become something more dangerous. It was the laughter of beings who did not fear the test placed before them. Who saw complexity not as a roadblock, but as an invitation to play. The Kthari had always believed that intelligence was a matter of methodical analysis, of careful, disciplined thinking. But here, these humans were demonstrating a different kind of brilliance, one that thrived in uncertainty, that found solutions not by rigid logic, but by creative adaptation. Zirax clenched their hands, claws pressing against the smooth surface of the podium. Very well, they said, forcing their voice into measured calm. If you claim to understand this so thoroughly, then solve it. Now. Completely. A murmur of excitement ran through the human crowd. The young scientist, the one who had laughed first, grinned. Challenge accepted. What followed was nothing short of breathtaking. A team of human minds worked together, building on each other's knowledge without hesitation. Where the Kthari viewed learning as an isolated pursuit, these humans shared. They adapted, combined strategies, tested theories on the fly. Within minutes, the once mystifying puzzle was reduced to a simple sequence of steps, solved not through brute force logic, but through sheer understanding. Zirax felt something twist in their chest. It was done. The solution lay before them, undeniable and devastating. And for the first time in their long, prestigious career, Zirax did not know what to say. Zirax sat frozen, their claws curled into tight knots, as the last remnants of their once impossible puzzle dissolved under human scrutiny. The solution, which had eluded entire civilizations, now sat dissected before them, a mere exercise in pattern recognition to these primates. The weight of what had just happened pressed against Zirax's chest like a collapsing star. The human scientists had not only solved the trial of infinite reflections, but they had done so together, with an ease that was both astonishing and infuriating. Zirax had expected confusion, frustration, even admiration for the challenge presented. Instead, they had been met with laughter, amusement, and, worst of all, casual indifference. Not bad, the young human scientist said, stretching their arms behind their head. A bit tricky at first, but once you see the repeating cycles, it's just a matter of keeping track of the shifting nodes. Zirax's frills flared in disbelief. Not bad, they echoed. This puzzle has tested the greatest minds of the Dominion for centuries. The scientist shrugged. Yeah, well, maybe that's the problem. Zirax's bioluminescence pulsed erratically, a chaotic flicker of disbelief and frustration. Explain. The scientist leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table. You Kthari treat intelligence like a closed system, a series of equations to be solved with meticulous, step-by-step logic. But that's not how we think. Humans don't just analyze problems, we play with them. We experiment, we fail, we adapt. And sometimes, the answer isn't about grinding through calculations. Sometimes, it's about seeing the bigger picture. Zirax recoiled as if struck. The very foundation of their academic philosophy was being dismissed as narrow-minded. That was impossible. The Kthari were the intellectual apex of the galaxy. Their scholars spent lifetimes refining knowledge, preserving order, and uncovering truth through rigorous study. Yet these humans spoke of intelligence as something fluid, something that could be approached playfully. Another human, an older professor with silver in their hair, chimed in. There's an old saying on Earth, you don't truly understand something until you can teach it to a child. The fact that our kids play variations of your puzzle for fun? That means the logic behind it is deeply intuitive to us. Your species might have overcomplicated something that was always meant to be simple. Zirax's breath hitched. Overcomplicated? The notion was unthinkable. Yet, the longer they stared at the puzzle's final solved state, the harder it became to refute. A thought gnawed at the edges of Zirax's mind, one they dared not entertain. If humanity had mastered the logic behind the trial of infinite reflections without even knowing it was a challenge, then what else had the Kthari misunderstood about intelligence? Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Around the room, alien dignitaries exchanged murmurs, their expressions unreadable. The implications of this moment stretched far beyond personal embarrassment. This was a galactic paradigm shift. The Kthari had always positioned themselves as the pinnacle of intellectual superiority, but what if they had merely been looking in the wrong direction? Zirax exhaled slowly, steadying their nerves. Your approach, it is unconventional, they admitted, each word feeling like a wound. But intelligence must still be measured by something. There must be a definitive metric, a scale by which cognitive superiority is proven. The young scientist grinned. Maybe. But if your metric doesn't account for creativity, adaptability, and collaboration, then maybe you've been measuring intelligence the wrong way. The word struck like a blade to the gut. Zirax stood abruptly, their robes swirling as they turned from the table. They had come here to humble humanity. Instead, they had been the ones humbled. Every instinct told them to leave, to retreat back to the comforting rigidity of Kthari academia. And yet, something kept them rooted in place. For the first time in their life, Zirax was faced with a problem they did not know how to solve. And for the first time, they wondered if the answer could be found in thinking like a human. Zirax had spent their life believing that intelligence was a fixed hierarchy, a mountain to be climbed, with the Kthari perched at its peak, gazing down at the lesser minds below. But now, standing before these humans, watching them dissect and manipulate a puzzle that had confounded entire civilizations, they were forced to confront a terrifying truth. The mountain was an illusion. The humans had not climbed it. They had knocked it over, flattened it, and turned it into something else entirely, a playground. Intelligence, to them, was not about rigid discipline or painstaking calculations. It was fluid, creative, chaotic. It was play. And Zirax had no idea what to do with that. The auditorium still buzzed with murmurs, the weight of the revelation hanging thick in the air. Zirax's peers, scholars from other interstellar species, were exchanging glances, whispering to one another. Some looked fascinated, others uneasy. The Kthari, after all, had built their status on the foundation of superior intellect. If that foundation crumbled, what would remain? One of the human scientists, perhaps the most irritatingly confident one, leaned forward with an easy grin. So, Professor Zirax, ready for something harder? Zirax's frills twitched. Harder? The scientist pulled a small, handheld device from their pocket and activated it. A three-dimensional grid unfolded in the air, pulsing with interlocking symbols and shifting pathways. This is Tessera, a game developed on Earth about 80 years ago. It's a strategy puzzle, but it adapts to the player's thinking patterns. It's designed to be impossible to brute force. Zirac hesitated. The Kthari did not back down from intellectual challenges. To do so would be disgraceful. And yet, something about this situation was different. This was no longer a test of superiority. This was an invitation. Slowly, cautiously, Zirac reached out and activated the interface. The game flickered to life, its algorithms assessing their cognitive approach, adjusting itself to their thinking speed. Zirac analyzed the patterns, attempted a move. The grid shifted unpredictably. A mistake. A ripple of quiet amusement ran through the human crowd. Not mockery, but encouragement. Try again, the scientist said. Zirac exhaled sharply and adjusted their strategy, attacking the problem with the meticulous precision of a Kthari scholar. They calculated probabilities, mapped out sequences, yet every time they came close to solving it, the game adapted, twisting in ways they hadn't anticipated. Zirac's bioluminescence pulsed erratically. It's illogical, they murmured. It moves. That's the point, another scientist said. It forces you to think beyond the rules. If you follow a rigid structure, it'll outmaneuver you every time. The only way to win is to adapt. Adaptation. That word echoed in Zirac's mind, settling in a place they had never examined before. The Kthari valued discipline, methodical study, the slow accumulation of perfect knowledge. Humans, on the other hand, thrived in chaos. They didn't just learn the rules, they rewrote them. Zirac continued playing, but something in their approach shifted. Instead of resisting the game's unpredictability, they leaned into it. They experimented, tried different approaches, not with the cold detachment of a scholar, but with a sense of curiosity. And, for the first time, they felt something unexpected. Enjoyment. When the game finally displayed a completion sequence, a cheer went up from the humans around them. Zirac barely heard it. Their mind was racing, but not with frustration. With possibility. They looked at the humans with new eyes. These creatures were not just intelligent. They were something more dangerous. More formidable. They were imaginative. And imagination, Zirac realized with a shiver, was the kind of intelligence no algorithm, no doctrine, no rigid structure could ever truly contain. Zirac sat in stunned silence, their clawed fingers hovering just above the now dormant game interface. The final sequence of Tessera still flickered in their mind, a ghostly afterimage that refused to fade. It wasn't the complexity of the game that unsettled them, it was the realization of how they had solved it. Not with Kthari logic. Not with careful, methodical analysis. They had won by thinking like a human. The weight of that truth pressed against Zirac's chest like the gravitational pull of a dying star. They had spent their entire career believing that intelligence was a rigid structure, an ascending ladder with carefully measured steps. Yet, here was an entire species that defied that philosophy. Humans had no patience for carefully measured steps. They leaped, they stumbled, they played, and somehow, they still landed on their feet. The murmurs in the auditorium had grown into something more tangible, something heavier. The other alien dignitaries were no longer whispering, they were openly discussing what had just transpired. Zirac could see it in their expressions, the same disbelief, the same slow-dawning realization. The Kthari had come here to test humanity. Instead, humanity had tested them. Across the room, the human scientist who had first laughed at the puzzle leaned forward with a knowing smirk. "So," he said, drumming his fingers against the table, "what do you think, Professor? Still believe intelligence is just about memorizing patterns?" Zirac's frills twitched. They were still reeling from the implications, but they could not afford to show weakness. Kthari scholars did not lose. They learned. Slowly, they straightened, their bioluminescence shifting from the erratic flickers of confusion to the measured glow of contemplation. Your species is unorthodox, Zirac admitted carefully. I had assumed intelligence was a matter of structured reasoning. But you have shown me another form of it, one I had not accounted for. The scientist grinned. We call it thinking outside the box. Zirac exhaled, still struggling to grasp the sheer alienness of human cognition. It is reckless, they said, though there was no heat in their words. Undisciplined. Chaotic. The older human professor chuckled. Yes. And it works. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? It worked. Humanity had not simply solved the Kthari puzzle, they had understood it on a fundamental level, so deeply embedded in their culture that they had reduced it to a child's game. They had taken a test meant to prove their inferiority and turned it into an opportunity. A ripple of unease passed through Zirac. If humans could do this to the trial of infinite reflections, what else had the Kthari overlooked? How many other unsolvable problems had humanity already conquered without even realizing their significance? The political implications were staggering. The Kthari had long positioned themselves as the intellectual elite of the galaxy, their dominion built upon their cognitive superiority. But now, Zirac was beginning to wonder if that superiority had never truly existed at all. Perhaps the Kthari were not the rulers of the galactic intellectual hierarchy. Perhaps they had merely been playing a different game altogether. A voice crackled through the comms. A Kthari official, watching from a remote location, spoke in clipped, urgent tones. Professor Zirac, return to the delegation. Now. Zirac recognized the barely concealed tension in the official's voice. This had not gone as the Dominion had planned. What was meant to be a demonstration of Kthari intellectual dominance had turned into something else entirely, an upset. Zirac's first instinct was to comply. To retreat to the familiar confines of Kthari academia, to write an official analysis that downplayed today's events. To rationalize it, to frame it as an anomaly rather than an undeniable truth. But something inside them resisted. They looked at the humans again, their laughter, their confidence, the sheer joy they took in solving problems. It was not just intelligence they wielded. It was imagination. And imagination, Zirac realized, was not something the Kthari had ever truly valued. They turned back to the comms. Their voice, when they finally spoke, was calm. Steady. No. A stunned silence followed. The official's response was immediate. Excuse me? Zirac took a slow breath. I will remain here, they said. There is more to learn. For the first time in their life, Zirac was no longer certain of the path ahead. But for the first time, uncertainty did not feel like failure. It felt like possibility. Zirac had never defied a direct order from the Kthari Dominion before. Defiance, after all, was illogical. The Kthari had built their civilization on order, precision, and intellectual hierarchy. They did not tolerate deviation, nor did they accept uncertainty. And yet, as they severed the comm link, silencing the urgent demands of their superiors, Zirac felt something unexpected. Relief. They turned to the humans, who were still watching them with varying degrees of amusement and curiosity. The scientist who had first challenged them, Jason, Zirac recalled, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You just pissed off your entire delegation, didn't you? Zirac exhaled through their nasal vents, their bioluminescence pulsing in shades of cautious defiance. Yes. I imagine there will be consequences. Jason smirked. Yeah, welcome to humanity. We piss off authority all the time. Zirac steadied him, perplexed yet fascinated. Defying authority was not just something these humans did, it was something they valued. They challenged power structures, questioned the unshakable, rewrote the rules as they saw fit. And somehow, against all logic, it worked for them. The older professor, the one who had first introduced the concept of thinking outside the box, tapped his fingers on the table. You said you wanted to learn more, Professor Zirac. Are you sure you're ready for that? Zirac hesitated. They had spent their entire life as a scholar, revered for their intellect. To admit ignorance, to choose to be a student once more, it was not an easy thing. But today had proven that clinging to the old ways would only blind them further. I am, Zirac said at last. Teach me. A ripple of interest passed through the human scientists. One of them, a woman with a cybernetic interface along her temple, tilted her head. Well, that depends. What do you want to learn? Zirac considered the question. For most of their life, knowledge had been something pursued with discipline and structure. They had sought answers through study, logic, and careful analysis. But humans had revealed an entirely different approach, one that was intuitive, unpredictable, and deeply creative. They met the woman's gaze. I want to understand how your species thinks. How you approach problems. How you solve them in ways no other species does. Jason let out a low whistle. That's a pretty big ask. We're kind of all over the place. The professor chuckled. Indeed. But I think the best way for our friend here to learn is by experience. He turned to Zirac. How comfortable are you with trial and error? Zirac hesitated. Thari scholars do not typically approach knowledge through. Jason cut them off with a grin. Cool, because we do. Lesson 1, get ready to screw up a lot. Before Zirac could protest, the humans were already pulling up various exercises, logic games, lateral thinking puzzles, creative problem-solving scenarios. They threw challenges at Zirac that defied conventional structure, forcing them to think in ways they never had before. At first, it was infuriating. The unpredictability, the lack of order, the chaos of it all. Zirac failed more times in the next few hours than they had in the last decade. Their frills twitched with frustration, their bioluminescence flickering erratically. And yet, with each failure, something changed. Each mistake revealed a new way of thinking. Each wrong turn illuminated an unexpected path forward. It was like learning an entirely new language, not one of words, but of thought. For the first time in their life, Zirac was not learning by rigid study. They were learning by doing. The humans didn't just know things, they discovered them. They explored, they tested boundaries, they broke rules and rewrote them. And slowly, Zirac began to see the brilliance in it. By the end of the session, they had solved a puzzle designed specifically to outmaneuver rigid, structured thinking. The moment the final pattern aligned, a slow, creeping realization settled over them. This was intelligence in its purest form. Not just knowledge, but imagination. Zirac looked at the humans with something they had never felt toward another species before. Admiration. They had come here to test humanity. Instead, humanity had tested them. And they had failed, spectacularly. Yet, for the first time in their life, failure did not feel like a condemnation. It felt like an opportunity. Zirac straightened, their bioluminescence shifting to a steady, resolute glow. I will return to my people soon, they said, their voice quieter now, more measured. But when I do, I will not return as the scholar who left. Jason grinned. So what, you gonna teach them how to think like us? Zirac's frills twitched in something that might have been amusement. Perhaps. But first, I must learn more. The professor nodded, a knowing glint in his eyes. Then welcome to the human way of thinking, Professor Zirac. Lesson 2, the more you learn, the less you realize you know. Zirac exhaled, their mind already brimming with possibilities. For the first time in their life, they were not just a teacher. They were a student. And the universe had never felt so vast.